Hello, Business Law 1. Here is my video review for Chapter 15. This is a continuation of the sales contract section. We deal with performance and breach in a sales contract. First term you need to know is good faith. Good faith is required in all sales contracts. Good faith means fair dealing and cooperation. It cannot be excluded from any sales contracts. The couple main things I'd want you to know is the number one obligation of the seller and number one obligation of the buyer. The number one obligation of the seller is to tender conforming goods to the buyer. Tender conforming goods to the buyer. Tender means deliver or make available. Conforming means 100% as called for in the sales contract. The goods in a sales contract have to be 100% according to the sales agreement. That is called the perfect tender rule. Perfect means perfect. The goods offered must be 100% as called for in the sales contract. This changes a lot from the regular contract law, because in regular contract law, if you remember, we said substantial performance is not a breach. In sales contract, however, substantial performance is a breach because it has to be 100% as called for in a sales contract. That's called the perfect tender rule. The number one obligation of the buyer, that's an easy one. Very simple. Pay for conforming goods. If the goods are 100% as you ordered, you have to pay for them. So I want you to know number one obligation of the seller, number one obligation of the buyer. And note with the seller, there's really two parts to it. The tender part and the conforming part. So really two parts to the number one obligation of the seller. At the end of Chapter 15, they talk about the remedies of the buyer in case the seller breaches, and remedies of the seller in case the buyer breaches. The remedies of the buyer are really more numerous than the remedies of the seller. So say if the seller breaches, such as sends the wrong goods, sends the wrong items, what are the remedies of the buyer? Well, the buyer can cancel the contract, they can recover payment, they can use good old specific performance we've talked about before under regular contract law. And then the two new ones for the buyer I'd want you to know is something called cover. Cover is where the buyer can go out and get substitute goods to replace the ones that the seller should have sent. And another remedy of the buyer is replevin. This is where the buyer can recover the goods when they paid for them. So say that the buyer has paid for the goods, but the seller never shipped them or never delivered them. The buyer would sue in replevin, R-E-P-L-E-V-I-N, to recover the goods that they paid for. The remedies of the seller in case the buyer breaches, so say the buyer doesn't pay or pays with a bad check, what can the seller do? The seller can cancel the contract. The seller can recover the purchase price, because never forget, this is still a contract. They're supposed to pay it. The seller can withhold delivery. So say the buyer check bounces, they can stop delivery. The seller can resell the goods. They don't have to hold them forever. They can resell the goods. And then also to the last remedy of the seller, they can demand return of the goods if they're unpaid. So say the buyer didn't pay the amount or only paid a small portion, the seller has the right to demand return of the goods. So there's a lot of remedies for both the buyer and the seller. Actually, the buyer has more remedies under the Uniform Commercial Code. Again, remember the Uniform Commercial Code is statutory, which means it has a very high weight because statutes are the second highest level of laws that we have. So know the number one obligation of the seller, know the number one obligation of the buyer, and I would say know 4 or 5 remedies of the buyer and 4 or 5 remedies of the seller. Again, if you have any questions about anything we're doing in here, send me an email or a Canvas message. Hope you're all staying safe. Thank you very much.